When the courthouse guard stopped him at the door, Shaq didn't realize it was just the beginning of a fight that would pit him against one of the most powerful men in the city. And what happened next will make you stunned. Before continuing this amazing story, let us know where you're watching from. Also, subscribe to the channel for daily upcoming stories notifications. Let's begin the story. Shaq O'NEAL adjusted his tie in the mirror of his car. He was dressed in a sharp, tailored suit, navy blue with a crisp white shirt underneath. He had a routine hearing today at the courthouse, something minor, a traffic violation from a few months ago. He wasn't worried. In fact, he was calm. He'd been through worse. But as he stepped out of his car and walked toward the courthouse, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The courthouse was a massive, imposing building made of gray stone. People streamed in and out, most of them in a hurry. Shaq noticed the crowd, mostly white, with a few black and Hispanic individuals scattered here and there. He was used to standing out. At 7 feet 1 inch, he was hard to miss. But today, it wasn't just his height that made him feel different. It was the way people looked at him, the sideways glances, the subtle shifts in body language. He brushed it off and walked inside. The security line was long, but it moved quickly, for most people. Shaq watched as a white man in a suit walked through the metal detector without a second glance. A young white woman followed, her bag barely checked. Then it was Shaq's turn. He stepped forward, but the security guard, a middle-aged white man with a stern face, held up a hand. "Step aside, sir," the guard said, his tone cold. Shaq frowned. "Excuse me? You heard me. Step aside." Shaq hesitated but did as he was told. He stood to the side, watching as person after person was waved through. Minutes passed, then an hour. His frustration grew. He wasn't used to being treated like this, not anymore. He was Shaq O'NEAL, for crying out loud. He had money, fame, respect. But here in this courthouse, none of that seemed to matter. Finally, he couldn't take it anymore. "Hey," he said, stepping toward the guard. "What's the holdup? I've been waiting for over an hour." The guard didn't even look at him. "You'll wait until we're ready for you." Shaq's jaw tightened. "Ready for me? What does that even mean? I'm here for a hearing, just like everyone else." The guard finally turned to him, his eyes narrowing. "Listen, sir, I don't have time for this. If you can't wait quietly, I'll have you removed." Shaq felt a surge of anger, but he forced himself to stay calm. He wasn't going to give this guy the satisfaction of seeing him lose his cool. Instead, he stepped back and waited. But as he did, he noticed something. The other black individuals in the line, they were being stopped too. A young black man in a hoodie was being questioned aggressively. An older black woman was having her bag searched for the third time. Meanwhile, the white people walked through without a second glance. Shaq's stomach churned. He knew what this was. He'd experienced it before, in different ways. The subtle racism, the microaggressions. But this was different. This was blatant, in-your-face discrimination. And it wasn't just happening to him. It was happening to everyone who looked like him. As he stood there, a young black woman approached him. She was petite, with sharp features and a determined look in her eyes. "This always happens," she said quietly, her voice low but firm. "They think we're here to cause trouble." Shaq glanced at her. "You've seen this before?" She nodded. "Every time I come here, they profile us, make us wait, treat us like criminals. It's not just you." Shaq felt a mix of anger and sadness. He wanted to say something, to do something. But before he could, the guard called him forward. "You're up," the guard said, his tone still cold. Shaq stepped through the metal detector, his mind racing. This wasn't right. None of it was right. And as he walked deeper into the courthouse, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Shaq sat in the courthouse hallway, his hearing delayed yet again. He checked his watch. Another hour had passed. The frustration was building, but he kept his composure. He wasn't going to let them see him sweat. The young black woman from earlier, Maya, sat down next to him. She had a notebook in her hands, and she was scribbling something furiously. Shaq glanced at her. "You're not here for a hearing, are you?" She looked up, her eyes sharp. "Number, I'm a journalist. I'm investigating this courthouse." Shaq raised an eyebrow. "Investigating? For what?" Maya leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Systemic racism. It's everywhere here. The delays, the profiling, the way they treat people of color. It's not an accident. It's by design." Shaq frowned. "You think they're doing this on purpose?" Maya nodded. "I know they are, and I think it goes deeper than just a few security guards. There's a system in place, people in power, who want to keep us down." Shaq didn't know what to say. He wanted to believe it wasn't true, but the evidence was right in front of him. He'd seen it with his own eyes, and now, hearing it from Maya, it all started to make sense. Before he could respond, a commotion broke out at the security checkpoint. A black man in his 30s was being held back by two guards. He was protesting loudly, his voice echoing through the hallway. "I didn't do anything wrong," the man shouted. "Why are you treating me like this?" The guards didn't respond. They just pushed him against the wall, their hands on his shoulders. Shaq stood up, his instincts kicking in. He couldn't just sit there and watch this happen. "Hey!" he called out, his deep voice booming through the hallway. "What's going on here?" The guards turned to look at him, their expressions hardening. "Stay out of this, sir," one of them said. "This doesn't concern you." Shaq took a step forward. "It concerns me if you're treating people unfairly." The guards exchanged a look, and for a moment, it seemed like they might back down. But then a white officer stepped in, his hand resting on his belt. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step back," he said, his tone firm. Shaq's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being talked to like this, but he knew he had to be careful. One wrong move, and this could escalate quickly. Maya grabbed his arm. "Don't," she said quietly. "They're looking for a reason to take you down. Don't give it to them." Shaq hesitated, then nodded. He stepped back, but his eyes never left the guards. He watched as they dragged the man away, his heart pounding in his chest. As he sat back down, Maya leaned in again. "This is what I'm talking about," she said. "They target us, humiliate us, make us feel powerless. But we're not powerless. We just have to fight back." Shaq looked at her, his mind racing. He'd spent his life avoiding conflict, trying to rise above the racism and prejudice. But now, he wasn't so sure that was enough. Maybe it was time to fight back. Shaq and Maya sat in a small cafe across the street from the courthouse. The air was thick with tension, and Shaq could feel the weight of the day pressing down on him. He sipped his coffee, his mind still racing. "So, what's your plan?" Shaq asked, looking at Maya. "You're investigating this courthouse. What are you hoping to find?" Maya leaned forward, her eyes intense. "I'm looking for proof. Proof that this isn't just a few bad apples. Proof that there's a system in place, designed to keep people of color down." Shaq frowned. "And you think you'll find that proof here?" Maya nodded. "I know I will. I've been following this for months. There's a pattern. People of color are targeted, delayed, harassed, and it's not random. It's coordinated." Shaq thought about what he'd seen earlier. The way the guards had treated him. The way they'd treated the other black individuals in the courthouse. It all fit with what Maya was saying. But it was hard to believe. How could something like this happen in broad daylight? As they talked, Shaq noticed a group of officers entering the cafe. They were laughing and joking, completely oblivious to the people around them. But then one of them glanced in Shaq's direction, and his expression changed. He leaned over and whispered something to his colleagues, and they all turned to look. Shaq felt a chill run down his spine. He didn't like the way they were looking at him. It was the same look he'd seen from the security guard earlier, cold, dismissive, almost hostile. Maya noticed it too. "We should go," she said quietly. "Now." They stood up and headed for the door, but as they passed the officers, one of them stepped in front of Shaq. "You're Shaq O'NEAL, right?" the officer asked, his tone casual, but his eyes sharp. Shaq nodded. "Yeah, what's it to you?" The officer smirked. "Just making sure. We've got a list, you know. People to keep an eye on, and you're on it." Shaq's heart skipped a beat. "A list? What kind of list?" The officer didn't answer. He just stepped aside, letting Shaq and Maya pass. But as they walked out the door, Shaq couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. Shaq and Maya sat in Shaq's car, the engine idling softly. The encounter with the officers at the cafe had left them both on edge. Shaq gripped the steering wheel, his mind racing. A list? What kind of list? And why was his name on it? He turned to Maya, who was scrolling through her phone, her brow furrowed in concentration. "What did that cop mean by a list?" Shaq asked, his voice low but urgent. "You said you've heard rumors about this before. What's going on?" Maya looked up, her eyes sharp and focused. "It's exactly what it sounds like. A list of people, black leaders, activists, even celebrities, who are seen as threats to the system. They're targeted, monitored, and harassed. It's a way to keep us quiet, to make sure we don't challenge the status quo." Shaq shook his head, trying to process what she was saying. "But why me? I'm not an activist. I'm just a guy who got a traffic ticket." Maya gave him a pointed look. "You're not just a guy, Shaq. You're Shaq O'NEAL. You've got a platform, money, influence, and you're black. That's enough to make you a target." Shaq leaned back in his seat, running a hand over his face. He'd spent his life trying to avoid controversy, to rise above the racism and prejudice he'd faced. But now, it seemed like no matter how high he climbed, he couldn't escape it. "So what do we do?" he asked, finally. "If I'm on this list, what does that mean for me? For us?" Maya's expression hardened. "It means we fight back. We expose this. But to do that, we need proof. We need to see that list." Shaq raised an eyebrow. "And how do we do that? It's not like we can just walk into the courthouse and ask for it?" Maya smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of someone who knew they were about to take a big risk. "We don't have to. I've got a source inside the courthouse, someone who's willing to talk. But it's dangerous. If we get caught..." She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. Shaq understood. If they got caught, there would be consequences, serious ones. But he also knew he couldn't just walk away, not after what he'd seen today, not after realizing that this wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who looked like him. "Let's do it," Shaq said finally, his voice firm. "Let's find that list." Later that night, Shaq and Maya met Maya's source in a dimly lit parking garage on the outskirts of town. The man was nervous, constantly looking over his shoulder as he approached their car. He was middle-aged, with graying hair and a tired face. He introduced himself as Carl, a courthouse clerk who had worked there for over a decade. "You're playing with fire," Carl said as soon as he got into the back seat of Shaq's car. His voice was shaky, and he kept glancing out the window. "If anyone finds out I'm talking to you, we understand the risk. Maya said quickly. But we need your help. We need to see the list. Carl hesitated, then nodded. It's real. The list, I mean. It's not official, of course. It's something they keep off the books. But it's there. And your name's on it, Shaq. Shaq felt a chill run down his spine. Why? What did I do? Carl shook his head. It's not about what you did. It's about who you are. You're a black man with power, influence, and a voice. That's enough to make them nervous. Maya leaned forward, her eyes intense. We need proof, Carl. We need to see the list. Can you get it for us? Carl looked torn. I don't know. If I get caught, you'll be protected, Shaq said firmly. I've got resources, lawyers, connections. If anything happens to you, I'll make sure you're taken care of. Carl stared at him for a long moment, then sighed. All right, I'll do it. But it's going to take time, and you need to be careful. If they find out what you're doing... We'll be careful, Maya promised. Just get us the list. A few days later, Carl contacted Maya with a lead. He couldn't get the list itself. It was too heavily guarded. But he had managed to copy a few names and details. He sent them to Maya in an encrypted file. Shaq and Maya met at Shaq's house to go over the information. The names on the list were shocking. Community leaders, journalists, even a few local politicians. All of them were black or Hispanic. All of them were outspoken about issues like police brutality and systemic racism. This is bigger than I thought, Maya said, her voice barely above a whisper. This isn't just about the courthouse. This is about silencing anyone who challenges the system. Shaq nodded, his jaw tight. We need to take this public. We need to expose them. Maya shook her head. Not yet. We need more evidence. Right now, this is just a list of names. We need to connect it to the people behind it. We need to show how far this goes. Shaq leaned back, his mind racing. He wasn't used to this kind of fight. On the basketball court, he knew exactly what to do. But this was different. This was dangerous. All right, he said finally. What's the next step? Maya smiled, but there was no humor in it. We dig deeper, and we be ready for whatever comes next. The next morning, Shaq woke up to find his car vandalized. The tires were slashed, and the words, "Stay out of it," were spray-painted across the hood in bold red letters. He stood there, staring at the damage, his heart pounding. This wasn't just a warning. It was a threat. And it was clear that whoever was behind this list knew what he and Maya were up to. Maya arrived a few minutes later, her face pale as she saw the car. They're watching us, she said quietly. We need to be careful. Shaq nodded, his jaw clenched. Careful isn't going to be enough. We need to end this. Now. The stakes were higher than ever. Shaq and Maya had the first piece of the puzzle, but they knew it was only the beginning. The list was real, and the people behind it were dangerous. But Shaq wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not ever. Shaq stood in his driveway, staring at the vandalized car. The red spray paint glared back at him, a stark reminder of the danger they were in. Maya stood beside him, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. The morning sun felt harsh, almost mocking, as it illuminated the damage. They're sending a message, Maya said, her voice steady but laced with tension. They know we're digging, and they want us to stop. Shaq clenched his fists, his mind racing. He wasn't used to feeling powerless. On the basketball court, he'd always been in control. But this was different. This was a fight he didn't fully understand, and it was clear the stakes were life and death. We can't stop, Shaq said finally, his voice firm. If we back down now, they win, and I'm not letting that happen. Maya nodded, but her expression was grim. We need to be smarter about this. They're watching us. We can't afford any mistakes. Later that day, Shaq and Maya moved their operation to a safe house, a small, nondescript apartment on the outskirts of town. It belonged to a friend of Maya's, someone she trusted implicitly. The place was sparse with just the basics: a couch, a table, and a few chairs. But it was secure, and that was what mattered. They spread out the documents Carl had given them on the table, along with Maya's notes and research. The list of names was the centerpiece, but it was just the beginning. They needed to connect the dots to find out who was behind this and how far it went. We need to focus on the patterns, Maya said, pointing to the list. These people, they're all connected. They've all spoken out against the system in some way. And they've all been targeted. Shaq leaned over the table, studying the names. He recognized a few: local activists, a journalist who had been arrested during a protest, a city council member who had been pushing for police reform. It was a who's who of people who had challenged the status quo. So what's the end game? Shaq asked. What do they want? Maya sighed. Control. They want to silence anyone who threatens their power. And they're willing to do whatever it takes to make that happen. As they dug deeper, they began to uncover more pieces of the puzzle. Carl had managed to get them access to internal courthouse emails, and what they found was shocking. The list wasn't just a random collection of names. It was part of a coordinated effort to discredit and intimidate minority leaders. One email in particular stood out. It was from a high-ranking courthouse official to a local police captain. The subject line read, "Target List Update." The body of the email was brief but chilling. Attached is the updated list of individuals requiring additional scrutiny. Ensure all units are briefed. Priority targets are marked in red. Remember, discretion is key. Shaq felt a surge of anger as he read the email. This is insane, he said, his voice low but fierce. They're treating us like criminals just for speaking out. Maya nodded, her expression grim. This is the proof we need. But we have to be careful. If we go public with this too soon, they'll just cover their tracks. That night, as Shaq and Maya were reviewing the documents, they heard a noise outside. It was faint, but unmistakable, the sound of footsteps on gravel. Maya froze, her eyes darting to the window. Did you hear that? She whispered. Shaq nodded, his instincts kicking in. He moved to the window and peered out through the blinds. Outside, he saw two figures lurking in the shadows. They were dressed in dark clothing, their faces obscured. We need to go, Shaq said, his voice urgent. Now. They grabbed the documents and slipped out the back door, moving quickly and quietly through the alley behind the apartment. As they rounded the corner, they heard the sound of a door being kicked in. Shaq's heart pounded as he realized how close they'd come to being caught. Once they were safely away, Shaq and Maya regrouped in a nearby park. The adrenaline was still coursing through Shaq's veins, but he forced himself to stay calm. They couldn't afford to panic now. They're getting desperate, Maya said, her voice low. They know we're onto them, and they're trying to shut us down. Shaq nodded. Which means we're close. We need to take this public before they can stop us. Maya hesitated. It's risky. If we go public without all the evidence, they could spin this against us. We need to be sure. Shaq thought for a moment, then nodded. All right, but we can't wait too long. Every day we wait is another day. They have to cover their tracks. The next morning, Carl contacted them with a bombshell. He'd managed to get his hands on a document that outlined the entire operation. The list, the emails, even the names of the people behind it. It was everything they needed to expose the corruption. But there was a catch. Carl wanted out. He was scared, and he didn't want to be involved anymore. I've done my part, he he said over the phone, his voice trembling. "Now, it's up to you." Shaq and Maya knew what they had to do. They spent the next few hours compiling the evidence, preparing to take it public. But as they worked, Shaq couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Just as they were finishing, there was a knock at the door. Shaq and Maya exchanged a look, their hearts racing. Shaq moved to the door and peered through the peephole. Outside stood two police officers, their faces stern. "Open up," one of them said, his voice firm. "We need to talk." Shaq hesitated, then opened the door. The officers stepped inside, their eyes scanning the room. "We've received a tip that you're in possession of stolen documents," one of them said. "We need to see them." Shaq's mind raced. He knew this was a setup. If they handed over the documents, they'd lose everything. But if they refused, they'd be arrested. Maya stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "We don't have any stolen documents, but we do have evidence of corruption within the courthouse, and we're prepared to take it public." The officers exchanged a look, then one of them smirked. "Good luck with that." As they left, Shaq and Maya knew they were running out of time. They had to act fast. The final showdown was coming. Shaq and Maya had the evidence, but the forces against them were powerful and dangerous. The fight wasn't just about exposing corruption anymore. It was about survival. And Shaq wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not ever. Shaq and Maya knew they couldn't wait any longer. The police visit was a clear warning. They were out of time. If they didn't act now, the evidence they'd worked so hard to gather would disappear, and so would their chance to expose the truth. "We need to go public," Maya said, pacing the room. "We can't sit on this anymore. If we wait, they'll bury it." Shaq nodded, his jaw tight. "But we need to do it right. If we just drop this online or send it to a reporter, they'll spin it. We need to make sure people hear it directly from us." Maya stopped pacing and looked at him. "What are you thinking?" Shaq took a deep breath. "A press conference. We'll call every major news outlet, hold it somewhere public, and lay it all out. No filters, no spin. Just the truth." Maya's eyes lit up. "That could work, but it's risky. They'll come after us hard." Shaq shrugged. "They're already coming after us. At least this way, we'll have the public on our side." They spent the next few hours preparing. Maya reached out to her contacts in the media, while Shaq used his platform to spread the word. By the end of the day, the press conference was set. They would hold it the next morning at City Hall, in the heart of downtown. It was a bold move, but they needed to make a statement. That night, Shaq barely slept. His mind raced with thoughts of what could go wrong. What if no one showed up? What if the media didn't believe them? What if the people behind the list tried to stop them? But he pushed those thoughts aside. They didn't have a choice. They had to do this. The next morning, Shaq and Maya arrived at City Hall early. The square was already filling up with reporters, cameras, and curious onlookers. Shaq felt a surge of adrenaline as he stepped up to the podium. He was used to being in the spotlight, but this was different. This wasn't about basketball or entertainment. This was about justice. Maya stood beside him, her face calm but determined. She gave him a nod, and he began. "Thank you all for coming," Shaq said, his deep voice carrying across the square. "I know many of you are wondering why we call this press conference. The truth is, we're here to expose something that's been hidden for far too long." He paused, letting his words sink in. The crowd was silent, hanging on his every word. "Over the past few weeks, we've uncovered evidence of systemic corruption within our courthouse and law enforcement agencies. This isn't just about a few bad apples. This is about a coordinated effort to silence and intimidate people of color, activists, leaders, and everyday citizens who dare to speak out against injustice. He held up a folder containing the documents they'd gathered. In this folder is proof. Proof that there is a list of individuals who have been targeted simply because of the color of their skin and their willingness to challenge the system. My name is on that list. So are the names of many others who are here today. The crowd erupted in murmurs, and the cameras clicked furiously. Shaq could feel the energy shifting, the weight of his words hitting home. Maya stepped forward, taking the microphone. This isn't just about one courthouse or one city. This is about a system that has failed us for far too long. But today, we're taking a stand. We're saying, enough is enough. As Shaq and Maya spoke, the reaction was immediate. Social media exploded with hashtags like "Expose the List" and "Justice for All." The story spread like wildfire, and within hours, it was national news. But not everyone was on their side. The courthouse officials released a statement denying the allegations, calling Shaq and Maya misinformed and reckless. The police department announced an investigation, not into the list, but into how the documents had been obtained. Shaq knew this was coming. He'd expected the pushback. But what he didn't expect was the personal attacks. Within hours, rumors began circulating online. False stories about Shaq's past, accusations of him being a troublemaker and a divisive figure. Someone even leaked an old photo of him at a protest, trying to paint him as a radical. Maya was targeted too. Her credibility as a journalist was questioned, and her past work was scrutinized. It was clear that the people behind the list were fighting back, hard. But for every attack, there was also support. People from all walks of life rallied behind Shaq and Maya. Activists, celebrities, and even some politicians spoke out, demanding accountability. Protests began to form outside the courthouse, with people holding signs that read, "End the list" and "Justice now." Shaq felt a surge of hope. They weren't alone in this fight. But he also knew that the battle was far from over. That night, as Shaq was leaving his house, he noticed a car parked across the street. It was dark, with tinted windows, and it had been there for hours. He felt a chill run down his spine. Were they watching him again? He called Maya, his voice tense. "I think they're outside my house." Maya didn't hesitate. "Get out of there, now." Shaq grabbed a bag of essentials and slipped out the back door. As he drove away, he saw the car pull out behind him. His heart pounded as he realized he was being followed. Shaq drove through the city, trying to lose the tail. But the car stayed with him, weaving through traffic like a predator stalking its prey. He knew he couldn't lead them to Maya or the safe house. He had to think fast. He pulled into a crowded parking lot and ducked into a nearby store. As he watched from inside, he saw the car circle the lot, then finally drive away. He let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. When he met up with Maya later, she was pale but determined. "They're not going to stop," she said. "We need to take this to the next level." Shaq nodded. "What do you have in mind?" Maya smiled, but there was no humor in it. "We go after the people behind the list, not just the courthouse officials, the ones pulling the strings." Shaq felt a surge of adrenaline. "Let's do it." The fight was far from over. Shaq and Maya had exposed the list, but the real battle was just beginning. The people behind it were powerful, and they weren't going down without a fight. But Shaq wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. The stakes were too high, and the truth was too important. Shaq and Maya sat in a dimly lit room, surrounded by stacks of documents, laptops, and empty coffee cups. The press conference had shaken the system, but they knew it wasn't enough. The courthouse officials were just the tip of the iceberg. The real power lay with the people behind the scenes, the ones funding, orchestrating, and benefiting from the corruption. We need to follow the money, Maya said, her eyes scanning a spreadsheet on her laptop. These people didn't just wake up one day and decide to create a list. They're being paid, protected, and empowered by someone with deep pockets. Shaq leaned forward, his massive frame casting a shadow over the table. So, who's bankrolling this? Politicians? Corporations? Who's got that kind of power? Maya hesitated, then pulled up a file on her screen. I've been digging into the courthouse's financial records. There's a pattern here. A lot of the funding for security initiatives and special projects comes from a shell company called Blackstone Holdings. It's registered offshore, but I managed to trace it back to a group of wealthy donors with ties to local politicians and law enforcement. Shaq frowned. Blackstone Holdings? Sounds like some shady stuff. What do we know about them? Not much, Maya admitted. They're careful, but I've got a lead. One of their former employees, a guy named Victor Lane, was fired a few months ago. He might be willing to talk. Shaq raised an eyebrow. And you think he'll just hand over the information? Maya smirked. Not exactly. But everyone has a price. And if they don't, they usually have a weakness. We just need to find his. Victor Lane lived in a modest apartment on the outskirts of the city. When Shaq and Maya showed up at his door, he looked nervous, but not entirely surprised. I figured someone would come knocking eventually, he said, stepping aside to let them in. His apartment was cluttered with stacks of papers and empty takeout containers scattered everywhere. But I didn't think it would be Shaq O'NEAL. Shaq gave him a small smile. We're not here to cause trouble, Victor. We just need answers. Victor sighed and sat down on the couch. Look, I don't know much. And what I do know, it's dangerous. These people don't play around. Maya stepped forward, her tone calm but firm. We know about Blackstone Holdings. We know they're funding the list. But we need to know who's behind it. Who's calling the shots? Victor hesitated, then shook his head. I can't. If they find out I talked, Shaq leaned in, his voice low but intense. Victor, we're not asking for you to do this for us. We're asking you to do it for everyone who's been targeted, harassed, and silenced. This isn't just about a list. It's about justice. Victor stared at him for a long moment, then sighed. All right, but you didn't hear this from me. Victor handed them a flash drive. Everything I know is on here. Financial records, emails, names. But the guy you're looking for is Richard Holloway. He's the one pulling the strings. He's got connections everywhere. Politicians, judges, cops. He's untouchable. Shaq's eyes narrowed. Richard Holloway? Why does that name sound familiar? Maya's face paled. He's a billionaire, owns half the city. Real estate, tech, media, you name it, he's got a hand in it. And he's got a reputation for being ruthless. Victor nodded. Yeah, well, that reputation is well earned. If he finds out you're digging into him, he'll bury you. Literally. Back at the safe house, Shaq and Maya reviewed the files on the flash drive. The evidence was damning. Richard Holloway wasn't just funding the list. He was orchestrating it. The goal? To maintain control. To silence anyone who threatened his power or profits. This is bigger than we thought, Maya said, her voice barely above a whisper. Holloway's not just some rich guy. He's a kingpin, and he's got the system in his pocket. Shaq clenched his fists. Then, we take him down. We expose him. Maya shook her head. It's not that simple. He's got too much power, too many people protecting him. If we go after him directly, we'll lose. Shaq leaned back, his mind racing. So what do? We can't just sit on this. Maya smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of someone who knew they were about to take a big risk. We don't go after him directly. We go after his reputation, we make him vulnerable, and then we let the system do the rest. Over the next few days, Shaq and Maya worked tirelessly to prepare their next move. They reached out to journalists, activists, and whistleblowers, building a coalition of people who were willing to stand up to Holloway. They also began leaking pieces of the evidence to the media, carefully timing each release to maximize the impact. The first leak was a bombshell, a series of emails between Holloway and courthouse officials discussing the list in chilling detail. The media went wild, and the public outcry was immediate. Holloway's name was everywhere, and for the first time, he was on the defensive. But Holloway wasn't going down without a fight. Within hours, his lawyers issued a statement denying the allegations and threatening legal action. His media empire went into overdrive, spinning the story and attacking Shaq and Maya's credibility. Shaq found himself at the center of a media storm. Reporters camped outside his house, and his social media was flooded with messages, some supportive, some hateful. But he didn't back down. He knew this was part of the game. The turning point came when a video surfaced online. It was security footage from the courthouse, showing Shaq being stopped by the guards while white individuals were waved through. The video went viral, and suddenly, the public narrative shifted. People began to see the truth, that this wasn't just about Shaq or Maya. It was about a system that was rigged against them. Protests erupted across the city, with people demanding accountability. Politicians who had once been silent began to speak out, calling for investigations and reforms. Even some of Holloway's allies started to distance themselves from him. Shaq and Maya knew this was their moment. They called another press conference, this time outside Holloway's corporate headquarters. The crowd was massive, with people from all walks of life coming together to demand justice. Shaq stepped up to the microphone, his voice steady, but powerful. "This isn't just about me. This isn't just about a list. This is about a system that has failed us for far too long. But today, we're saying enough is enough. Today, we're taking a stand." As he spoke, the crowd erupted in cheers. And for the first time, Shaq felt a glimmer of hope. They weren't just fighting for themselves. They were fighting for everyone who had been silenced, targeted, and oppressed. The fight was far from over. Richard Holloway was still powerful, and the system was still rigged. But Shaq and Maya had struck a blow that had shaken the foundations of power. And they weren't going to stop until justice was served. The stakes were too high, and the truth was too important. The press conference outside Holloway's headquarters had sent shockwaves through the city. The crowd's energy was electric, and the media coverage was relentless. For the first time, Richard Holloway's empire seemed vulnerable. But Shaq and Maya knew this was just the beginning. Holloway was a fighter, and he wouldn't go down without a brutal counterattack. Within hours of the press conference, Holloway's legal team issued a statement calling the allegations baseless and defamatory. They threatened to sue Shaq, Maya, and every media outlet that had reported on the story. Holloway himself appeared on his own news network, sitting in a sleek, modern studio, his demeanor calm, but his eyes cold. "This is nothing more than a smear campaign," Holloway said, his voice smooth and controlled. "These accusations are lies, spread by individuals with a personal vendetta. I have always operated within the law, and I will not be intimidated by baseless attacks." The interview was masterfully crafted, designed to paint Holloway as the victim. But Shaq and Maya weren't fooled. They knew this was just the opening move in a much larger game. Maya had been carefully timing the release of the evidence they'd gathered. The first leak had exposed Holloway's connection to the list. The second leak, which dropped the day after the press conference, was even more damning. It included financial records showing how Holloway had funneled millions of dollars into courthouse security initiatives and special projects. Code words for the list and the harassment of minority leaders. The media frenzy intensified. Holloway's denials were starting to ring hollow, and even some of his staunchest allies began to distance themselves. Politicians who had once accepted his donations now claimed they had no idea where the money came from. The public outcry grew louder, with protests spreading to other cities. The third leak came from an unexpected source, a former employee of Holloway's who had decided to come forward. Her name was Elena Martinez, and she had worked as an executive assistant in Holloway's office for years. She reached out to Maya, offering to share what she knew. Shaq and Maya met Elena in a secluded park, far from prying eyes. She was nervous, constantly looking over her shoulder, but her resolve was clear. "I've seen things," Elena said, her voice trembling. "Things I can't forget. Holloway doesn't just fund the list, he controls it. He decides who gets targeted, who gets harassed, who gets silenced, and he doesn't care who gets hurt." She handed Maya a folder filled with documents, emails, memos, and meeting notes that detailed Holloway's involvement in the list. It was the smoking gun they'd been looking for. With Elena's evidence in hand, Shaq and Maya called one final press conference. This time, they held it in the heart of the city, with the courthouse as a backdrop. The crowd was even larger than before, with people from all walks of life coming together to demand justice. Shaq stepped up to the microphone, his presence commanding attention. "We've been called liars. We've been called troublemakers. But the truth is, we're just two people who decided to stand up and say enough is enough." He held up the folder Elena had given them. "In this folder is proof. Proof that Richard Holloway is the man behind the list. Proof that he has used his wealth and power to silence anyone who challenges him. But today, we're taking that power away." The crowd erupted in cheers, and the media cameras clicked furiously. Shaq felt a surge of hope. They were finally breaking through. The fallout was immediate. Holloway's stock prices plummeted, and his business partners began to cut ties. Politicians who had once defended him now called for investigations. Even his own employees started to speak out, sharing stories of corruption and abuse. Within days, federal authorities announced they were opening an investigation into Holloway and his companies. The courthouse officials who had been implicated in the list were placed on administrative leave, and the list itself was officially disbanded. For Shaq and Maya, the victory was bittersweet. They had exposed the truth and brought down one of the most powerful men in the city. But they knew the fight wasn't over. The system was still broken, and there were others like Holloway out there. Shaq stood on the steps of the courthouse looking out at the crowd. "This isn't the end," he said, his voice firm. "This is just the beginning. We've shown what's possible when we stand together, and we're not going to stop until justice is served for everyone." The crowd erupted in cheers, and Shaq felt a surge of pride. They had done the impossible. But he knew the real work was just beginning. In the weeks that followed, Shaq and Maya became symbols of resistance. They used their platform to advocate for systemic change, pushing for reforms in the justice system and beyond. They also started a foundation to support activists and whistleblowers, ensuring that others would have the resources they needed to fight for justice. But the fight wasn't without its costs. Shaq and Maya faced constant threats, and they knew they would always be targets. But they also knew they couldn't back down. The stakes were too high, and the truth was too important. As Shaq stood on the steps of the courthouse one last time, he felt a sense of peace. They had done what they set out to do, and they had shown that even in the face of overwhelming odds, justice was possible. As the crowd dispersed, Shaq noticed a man standing at the edge of the square. He was dressed in a dark suit, his face obscured by sunglasses. He didn't cheer or clap. He just watched. Shaq felt a chill run down his spine. He knew this wasn't over. The fight for justice never was. But he also knew he wasn't alone. And as long as there were people willing to stand up and fight, there was hope. Guys, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this story. Let us know about your thoughts in the comment section. Also subscribe the channel for daily stories notification.